January 13th, 1945, Foy, Belgium. The temperature hasn't been above freezing in weeks. The ground is white, the sky is gray, and the tree line of Bois Jacques, Jack's Wood, sits behind a company of American paratroopers who have just been ordered to step into the open. Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. Some of these men have been living in frozen foxholes for 25 days straight. No winter gear, half rations, constant artillery. And now they're walking across an open field toward a village full of Germans who've had 3 weeks to prepare for exactly this moment. Then the first man goes down, then a second. Nobody sees a muzzle flash. Nobody hears a report before the impact. The assault freezes. Officers shout. Men press into the snow looking for anything, a ditch, a fence post, a dead horse, anything between them and whatever is out there. And then one soldier turns, looks toward the village, and says 4 words. I see him. 1 shot, 1 kill. The assault moves again. This is the story of how that happened and why almost no one else in that field could have made that shot. If this kind of story matters to you, men who changed battles with nothing but nerve and a rifle, hit that subscribe button before we go any further. There are more stories like this one. To understand how that shot was possible, you have to go back. Not to Belgium, not to the army, but to the mountains of southwest Virginia, 20 years before the war. Clinchco, Virginia, Dickinson County, deep in the Appalachian coal fields, where the ridge lines are sharp, the hollows are dark by mid-afternoon, and most families put meat on the table the same way they had for generations, with a rifle and whatever the woods gave up. Darrell Cecil Powers was born there on March 13, 1923. Everyone called him Shifty. The nickname fit. He moved quietly, thought quickly, and noticed things other people walked right past. In the mountains, that combination wasn't remarkable. It was survival. He learned to shoot the way most boys in that country learned, early, often, and without instruction manuals. The target was usually a squirrel, a small, fast animal in dense canopy, rarely still, rarely in the open. You didn't get a second chance on a squirrel. You didn't have ammunition to waste. You learned to read the gaps in the trees, to estimate distance without measuring it, to feel the wind against your face and know what it would do to a bullet before you pulled the trigger. There were no scopes, iron sights only, open rear aperture, front post, and the gap between them. That was the entire system. Shifty never saw any reason to add glass to the equation. He didn't need it. By the time he was a teenager, stories had started circulating around Clinchco, that he could hit a coin tossed in the air, that he could drop a squirrel through a 3-inch gap in the branches at 100 yards. Whether every story was precisely true or not, the underlying fact was consistent. Shifty Powers could shoot, and he could shoot things that other people couldn't even see clearly. In 1941, before the United States entered the war, he was working as a machinist, precise, methodical work, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The same spatial awareness that made him a natural marksman made him good at that, too. He could visualize how things fit together, where the error was, what was out of alignment. On August 14, 1942, he enlisted. He was 19 years old. He could have gone into any branch. He volunteered for the paratroopers. At Camp Toccoa, Georgia, where Easy Company was being forged from scratch under the demanding eye of Captain Herbert Sobel, Shifty went through standard rifle qualification. The Army shot at 200 yards, 300 yards, and 500 yards. Shifty hit the maximum score at every distance. The instructors noted it. The men around him noticed it too, quietly, the way soldiers always notice who among them is genuinely dangerous. He was issued an M1 Garand, semi-automatic, 30-06 Springfield caliber, fed by an 8-round en-bloc clip that ejected with a distinctive metallic ping when the last round fired. It was one of the finest battle rifles of the war. General Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. But it was a standard infantry weapon, not a precision sniper system. No telescopic sight, no adjustable cheek piece, nothing custom. Shifty didn't ask for anything different. What the army had done, without fully realizing it, was take a man whose most important skills had been built over 2 decades in the Appalachian wilderness, put him through 6 months of physical and tactical training, and hand him a semi-automatic rifle. They thought they were making him a soldier. They had actually made him something considerably more dangerous. The question isn't whether Shifty Powers could shoot. The question is, what happens when that skill meets a frozen field in Belgium, a company of men pinned down in the snow, and a German sniper that trained intelligence officers couldn't find? That answer comes, but first, you need to understand the ground those men were fighting on and what it had already cost them before the first shot of January 13th was ever fired. The Ardennes, December 1944. The German offensive that began on December 16th caught the Allied command almost entirely off guard. 25 German divisions, roughly 200,000 men, punched through a thinly held 85-mile front in the forested highlands of Belgium and Luxembourg. The weather was deliberately chosen. Overcast skies grounded Allied air power, frozen roads held German armor, and the dense forest of the Ardennes swallowed entire columns before anyone on the American side fully understood what was happening. The 101st Airborne Division was pulled out of rest billets in Reims, France, loaded onto open trucks in the dead of night and driven north. No full briefing, no winter equipment. Some men climbed onto those trucks in garrison clothes with a single blanket. They arrived at Bastogne, a critical road junction the Germans needed to advance west, on December 19th, and immediately began setting up a defensive perimeter around the city. Easy Company was assigned the sector north of Bastogne, in and around a stretch of forest the men would come to know simply as Bois Jacques, Jack's Wood. The foxholes they dug there would become their world for the next 4 weeks. The ground was frozen solid. Digging even 2 feet down took hours of work with entrenching tools that rang off the earth like it was concrete. The men lined their holes with whatever they could find: branches, burlap, the coats off dead soldiers. None of it was enough. Night temperatures in that sector dropped as low as -28 degrees Celsius. Frostbite casualties began almost immediately. Men lost feeling in their feet and didn't report it because reporting it meant leaving, and leaving meant putting the man next to you in a worse position. The German forces holding the line opposite Easy Company were a combination of elements from the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, experienced, well-equipped, and fighting on ground they had prepared. Artillery came in regularly, day and night. Tree bursts were the particular terror. Shells detonating in the canopy above the foxholes and sending splinters of wood and steel downward into men who had no overhead cover. You couldn't dig deep enough to escape a tree burst. All you could do was press yourself flat and wait.
Between the artillery, the cold, the inadequate rations, and the constant low-level contact with German patrols, Easy Company was being steadily ground down. By the first week of January, the company that had jumped into Normandy, fought through Holland, and arrived in the Ardennes was a shadow of its authorized strength. And the situation inside the company was complicated further by leadership problems that every man could feel, but few spoke about openly. Lieutenant Norman Dyke, Easy Company's commanding officer, was an officer whose relationship with his men had deteriorated badly under the pressure of sustained combat. The soldiers respected the rank. They had serious doubts about the man. First Sergeant Carwood Lipton, one of the most capable non-commissioned officers in the regiment, was holding the company together through force of personal example and the kind of quiet authority that doesn't come from a commission. It comes from character. By January 9th, Easy Company was being tasked with increasing patrol and outpost activity north of Bastogne, probing toward the village of Foy. Those patrols were taking casualties. The men coming back were not the same men who had gone out. On January 9th alone, Easy Company suffered some of the worst losses it would record during the entire Ardennes campaign, not in a single dramatic engagement, but in the grinding incremental violence of patrol contact, artillery, and a cold that killed as surely as any bullet. By January 13th, some men in Easy Company had been in those foxholes for 25 consecutive days. The order to assault Foy came anyway. How do you ask men who have been living like that, frozen, hollowed out, short on everything, to stand up, fix bayonets, and walk across an open field into a fortified village? The answer is that you don't ask, you order, and you hope that what's left of their training, their loyalty to each other, and whatever is still burning inside them is enough to carry the line forward. On January 13th, it almost wasn't, and the reason had nothing to do with courage.
Foy was not a strategic prize by any conventional measure. It was a small Belgian farming village, a church, a handful of stone farmhouses, a road running north toward Neufélise, and fields on every side. In peacetime, it would barely appear on a regional map. In January 1945, it was one of the most important pieces of ground in the entire Ardennes sector. The reason was simple: the road. The main supply and advance route running north from Bastogne passed directly through Foy. As long as German forces held the village, that road was closed. And as long as that road was closed, the Allied push to break out of Bastogne, link up with Patton's Third Army coming from the south, and begin rolling back the German salient was stalled. Foy had to fall. There was no option to go around it, no clever flanking solution that avoided the problem. The village sat on the only viable route, surrounded by terrain that made off-road movement for any significant force nearly impossible in winter conditions. German commanders understood this perfectly. The defenders had been in Foy since December 21st, the same day the German encirclement of Bastogne was completed. That gave them 3 full weeks to study the approaches, identify fields of fire, fortify buildings, register their artillery and mortars on the open ground between the forest and the village edge, and position snipers and machine gun teams in the elevated positions that the stone buildings naturally provided. The church was particularly useful. Its tower offered a commanding view across the fields to the east, where any assault from the Bois Jacques sector would have to cross open ground for several hundred yards before reaching the first buildings. A single observer in that tower could direct fire across the entire killing ground. A single marksman in the right window could stop an infantry assault cold, not by killing everyone, but by dropping enough men fast enough to make the survivors freeze, which is exactly what happened. The American assault plan for January 13th tasked Easy Company and Item Company of the 506th PIR with the direct assault on Foy from the east, out of the Bois Jacques tree line, across the open fields, into the village. Fire support would come from the tree line itself, with machine guns and BAR teams providing suppression while the assault elements moved forward. A reserve would be held back to exploit any breach. On paper, it was a workable plan. The men of the 506th had executed more complicated assaults against better prepared defenses. But the plan assumed the assault element could maintain momentum across that open ground, that the men could keep moving, stay together, and close the distance before the defenders could concentrate enough fire to stop them. That assumption was about to be tested by a single German soldier with a rifle and a very good position. The attack jumped off in the gray morning light of January 13th, snow on the ground, temperature below freezing, visibility limited by the flat winter light that flattened shadows and made depth perception unreliable. Easy Company came out of the trees and began moving across the fields toward Foy. Within minutes, men started going down, not from artillery, not from machine gun fire, from single, precise rifle shots, the kind that arrive without warning, without the mechanical chatter that tells you where to look, without any of the visual cues that trained infantrymen use to locate and suppress a threat. One moment, a man was moving. The next, he was in the snow. The assault began to stall. Men went to ground instinctively, pressing into the snow, scanning the village for any sign of a muzzle flash, any movement in a window, any disturbance in the geometry of the buildings. Officers shouted for men to keep moving. The men who kept moving were the ones getting shot. At least 3 Easy Company soldiers were hit before the advance froze completely.
In the snow, in the cold, with no cover and no clear target, the entire assault, weeks of preparation, 25 days of suffering in those foxholes, the strategic objective that Corps and division commanders had been pressing for, was on the edge of collapsing into confusion. Somewhere in that village, one man with one rifle had effectively stopped a company of American paratroopers in their tracks. He had cover, concealment, elevation, and the initiative. The men in the field had none of those things. What they had, though they didn't know it yet, was Shifty Powers.
In infantry combat, a sniper's greatest advantage is not the rifle, it is time. Every second a sniper remains undetected, he controls the engagement. He chooses when to fire, who to target, and when to stop. The men in the open have no say in any of those decisions. They can suppress, spray fire at likely positions, hope to force the shooter to keep his head down. But suppression without a confirmed target is ammunition spent against geometry. It buys seconds, it doesn't solve the problem. The German sniper at Foy had already demonstrated that he understood this perfectly. He had fired multiple times, dropped multiple men, and remained invisible. No one had seen a muzzle flash. No one had identified a window, a roof line, a shadow that moved wrong. The shots were simply arriving, and men were falling, and the field between the tree line and the village was becoming a place where forward movement meant dying. Standard infantry doctrine in this situation called for identifying the approximate direction of fire, concentrating machine gun and automatic weapon fire on likely positions, and using smoke, if available, to screen movement. Easy Company had limited smoke. The direction of fire was roughly known from the village, but from the village covered dozens of windows, a church tower, roof lines, gaps between buildings. Without a precise location, suppression was largely theater. What was needed was a set of eyes that could see what other eyes could not. Shifty Powers was in that field. He had spent the advance the way he spent most of his time in combat, moving deliberately, watching everything, processing the landscape the way a hunter processes terrain. Not looking for movement specifically, looking for the absence of consistency, for the thing that didn't belong, for the gap in the pattern. It was the same cognitive process he had used since boyhood in the Virginia mountains. When you hunt in dense forest, you learn very quickly that you will almost never see the whole animal. You see a piece of it, an ear, a tail, the line of a back against a different texture. Your brain learns to complete the picture from fragments. It learns to recognize what should be there and flag what shouldn't. He looked toward the village. He scanned the buildings methodically, not in a panic, not sweeping randomly, but the way a man looks at terrain he is trying to read. And somewhere in that geometry of stone and shadow and winter light, something was wrong. A window, a specific angle, the way the light was sitting in the frame or wasn't sitting the way it should. A shape that was slightly inconsistent with the surrounding architecture. The position would later be confirmed as connected to either the church or a building in very close proximity, elevated with a restricted but effective line of fire across the eastern approach. Shifty raised his M1 Garand. Iron sights, no scope. A standard-issue rifle that had been through Normandy, Holland, and weeks in a frozen forest. He said, clearly enough for the men nearby to hear, "I see him." He fired once. The shot crossed whatever distance separated him from that window. Accounts placed the engagement at a range consistent with aimed rifle fire, likely between 100 and 200 yards given the geometry of the field and the village edge. The bullet went where he put it. When the village was taken and American soldiers moved through the buildings, the German sniper was found. The bullet had struck him in the center of the forehead. First Sergeant Carwood Lipton and Sergeant Rodney Wynn both later confirmed the wound. One shot, dead center. The German had a scoped rifle. He had a prepared position. He had elevation and concealment and had already demonstrated that he could shoot accurately enough to stop a company-sized assault. On every technical measure available to him, he should have been the harder man to kill. He wasn't. With the sniper neutralized, the immediate threat to the assault was removed. Easy Company's forward momentum could resume. The men who had been pressing themselves into the Belgian snow could get back on their feet and continue toward Foy. The village fell that day. One shot ended the standoff, but the question of how that shot was even possible, how a man with open iron sights outperformed a trained sniper with optics under combat stress after weeks of physical deterioration, that question deserves a real answer, because it isn't luck and it isn't myth. The physics and the psychology of what Shifty Powers did in that field are documented and explainable, and they start not in Belgium, but in everything that came before it. If you're watching this and feeling something, that's the point. Give this video a thumbs up. It takes 2 seconds and it helps this channel reach the people who need to hear these stories. We're building something real here. Subscribe and be part of it.
Start with a hardware comparison, because it matters. The German sniper at Foy was almost certainly armed with a Karabiner 98K, the standard bolt-action rifle of the Wehrmacht, fitted with a ZF-4 telescopic sight, a 4-power optic that gave the shooter a magnified, precise view of his target. The ZF-4 was not the finest sniper optic of the war, but it was entirely adequate for the ranges involved at Foy. It allowed the shooter to identify targets clearly, hold a precise aim point, and confirm his hits. Combined with a prepared position, elevation, and concealment, it represented a significant tactical advantage over any rifleman shooting iron sights in the open. Shifty Powers was shooting a standard M1 Garand with the factory aperture sights it came with from Springfield Armory, a circular rear aperture and a front post, no magnification, no range adjustment for the specific distance to target, no wind compensation dial, nothing between his eye and that window except air, winter light, and whatever his brain was doing in the half-second between acquiring the target and breaking the shot. On paper, this should not have been a contest. But marksmanship at combat ranges is not primarily an optical problem. It is a perception and judgment problem. And there, the equation flipped entirely in Shifty's favor. The concept that best explains what Shifty was doing is sometimes called Kentucky windage, a term that sounds informal but describes something real and sophisticated. It refers to the instinctive, non-calculated compensation a shooter makes for wind, distance, and target movement without using any mechanical adjustment. It is not guessing. It is pattern recognition operating at a speed that bypasses conscious calculation entirely. The shooter doesn't think wind is approximately 8 miles per hour from the left, distance is approximately 150 yards, therefore I hold 2 inches right. The shooter simply knows where to put the front post, because he has made that judgment thousands of times before, in different conditions, at different distances, against targets that didn't hold still. Shifty had been building that database since he was old enough to carry a rifle.
The squirrel hunting of his youth wasn't recreational context. It was the specific training regime that produced this capability. Squirrels in dense Appalachian forest are small, fast, and almost never fully visible. They move through canopy gaps that open and close in fractions of a second. The shot, when it presents itself, is brief. The distance varies constantly. The light is almost always broken and inconsistent, and there is no second chance. The sound of a missed shot sends every squirrel within 100 yards into cover. You learn to get it right the first time, every time, or you go home empty-handed. Multiply that by thousands of hours over 2 decades, and you have something the Army's marksmanship program could not replicate in 6 months of training. You have a nervous system that has been calibrated through repetition and consequence to put a bullet through small targets in difficult conditions without conscious calculation. There is also the machinist's contribution to consider. Shifty had worked to tolerances of 1/1000th of an inch before he ever put on a uniform. That kind of work builds a spatial precision, an ability to visualize exactly where things are in 3 dimensions that translates directly to marksmanship. The front sight post has to be at a precise position relative to the rear aperture. The relationship between the trigger picture and the target has to be held consistently through the trigger pull. These are fundamentally the same cognitive and muscular skills that a machinist uses every day. Shifty had been doing that work for years. And then there was the condition of the men in that field on January 13th. 3 weeks of sub-zero temperatures, inadequate food, chronic sleep deprivation, physical depletion that most people in peacetime never approach. These conditions degrade fine motor control, slow reaction time, and compromise the ability to hold a steady aim. They should have made the shot harder. For most soldiers, they would have. Shifty's baseline was so far above the standard that even significantly degraded, he was still operating at a level that most trained marksmen could not match at their best. At 80 years old, decades after the war, he could still put rounds into a 6-inch circle at 300 yards with iron sights. The capability was not a wartime peak, it was a permanent condition of the man. The German sniper had optics, preparation, and position. What he didn't have was 20 years of Appalachian mountain hunting behind his trigger finger. That was the difference. Not technology, not doctrine, not superior training. One man had built something that couldn't be issued, couldn't be trained in a standard cycle, and couldn't be replicated by adding glass to a rifle. And Foy wasn't even the first time that capability had changed the outcome of a firefight. 3 weeks earlier, on a frozen morning in December, Shifty Powers looked across a snow-covered field and saw something that trained intelligence officers, aerial reconnaissance, and every other set of eyes in the sector had completely missed. What he saw would have killed 150 men if he hadn't been the one looking. December 29th, 1944, Bois Jacques. Easy Company had been on the Foy perimeter for 10 days. The front had settled into the grinding rhythm of defensive warfare, patrols, artillery exchanges, outpost duty, and the constant, exhausting work of simply surviving in conditions that were trying to kill men just as efficiently as the Germans were. The snow was deep. The trees offered cover from observation, but no protection from the cold or from the tree bursts that the German artillery had learned to deliver with uncomfortable precision. Shifty Powers was at his position, doing what he did whenever there was a pause in direct action, watching. Not watching for movement specifically, watching the way a hunter watches a tree line before first light, building a complete picture of the landscape, cataloging every element of the terrain opposite him until the composition was fixed in memory. The ridgeline, the clearings, the positions of individual trees, the shadows cast by specific features at specific times of day. When you know exactly what a piece of ground looks like, anything that changes becomes immediately visible. Not because you are looking for it, but because your brain registers the inconsistency automatically. Something was wrong with the tree line across from Easy Company's position. There was a tree standing in a location where no tree had stood the day before. To anyone else, glancing at a snow-covered forest in flat winter light, it would have been invisible. One more dark shape among dozens of dark shapes, at a distance, partially obscured by other vegetation. The casual observer would have seen forest. Shifty saw a discrepancy. Something had changed in a composition he had memorized, and the change was in exactly the wrong place. He went to First Sergeant Carwood Lipton. "The tree," he said, "wasn't there yesterday." Lipton listened. In Easy Company, when Shifty Powers told you he saw something, you looked seriously at what he was pointing at. Lipton looked. He saw what Shifty was describing, the outline, the position, the way it sat slightly wrong against the background. He escalated immediately. What Shifty Powers had identified was a German 88mm Flak 36, one of the most feared and versatile weapons in the entire Wehrmacht arsenal. The 88 had begun the war as an anti-aircraft gun, but German commanders had quickly discovered that its flat trajectory, high muzzle velocity, and devastating shell made it equally lethal in the direct fire role against tanks, fortifications, and infantry in the open. A single 88mm round hitting a group of men in a foxhole line could kill or wound everyone within a 15-foot radius.
against unprotected infantry crossing open ground, the exact scenario Easy Company would be executing 2 weeks later at Foy. It would have been catastrophic.
The gun crew had camouflaged the weapon carefully. They had used cut branches and netting to approximate the profile of a tree, positioning it at the edge of the German-held tree line where it blended with the natural vegetation. From the air, it would have looked like forest. From ground level, at distance, in winter light, it looked like a tree. Aerial reconnaissance had flown over that sector. Intelligence officers had studied the photographs. Trained analysts whose job was specifically to identify camouflaged enemy positions had examined the available imagery. None of them had flagged the position. The gun had been sitting there, undetected, for at least 72 hours. Shifty Powers found it because a tree was in the wrong place. The 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion was contacted. 6 105mm howitzers were laid on the target coordinates. They fired a time-on-target barrage, a technique where all rounds are calculated to arrive simultaneously, denying the target any warning between the first impact and the subsequent shells. The position was destroyed. The gun was eliminated. The crew did not survive. The men of Easy Company who would walk across that open field on January 13th never knew how close they had come to walking into the direct fire of an 88mm gun that nobody had told them was there. They never knew that the reason it wasn't there when they made that walk was a machinist from Clinchco, Virginia, who had memorized a tree line in December and noticed when the composition changed. This is the part of Shifty Powers' story that receives almost no attention. The shot at Foy is the moment people remember, but the tree that wasn't there may have been the more important intervention. Because a hidden 88 firing into an assault formation doesn't produce one casualty, it produces a massacre. After Foy fell and the German defensive ring north of Bastogne broke, Easy Company kept moving. Germany, Austria, the end of the war. And through all of it, Normandy, Holland, the Ardennes, the drive into the Reich, Shifty Powers never took a wound. In a company that suffered casualties at every major engagement, that fact alone demands an explanation.
Foy fell on January 13, 1945. The next day, the 506th PIR pushed north toward Noville and Cobru, continuing the drive to break the German salient and open the road to Houffalize. The momentum that had been stalled for weeks, by cold, by attrition, by a single sniper in a village window, was finally moving. Bastogne's encirclement had already been broken by Patton's Third Army from the south on December 26th, but the northern push required clearing every defended village on the route one at a time in conditions that hadn't improved. Easy Company kept going. Through January and into February, the 506th Airborne pushed deeper into the Ardennes, then crossed into Germany itself. The war that had seemed interminable from the bottom of a foxhole in Bois Jacques was, from the perspective of February 1945, clearly in its final phase. But final phases of wars kill men just as efficiently as their opening ones, and nobody in Easy Company was counting on anything until it was actually over. Shifty Powers was there for all of it. He had jumped into Normandy on the night of June 5, 1944, in the opening hours of D-Day. One of the thousands of paratroopers dropped behind German lines in darkness and confusion, scattered across the Norman countryside, expected to find their units, their objectives, and their nerve simultaneously. He had fought through Holland during Operation Market Garden in September, one of the most ambitious and ultimately costly Allied airborne operations of the war. He had endured the Ardennes. He would finish the war in Berchtesgaden, Austria, in May 1945. At no point during any of it was he wounded, not a scratch. In a company that had been devastated at multiple points, men killed on the jump into Normandy, men killed in Holland, men killed in foxholes they never left, Shifty Powers walked through the entire war physically intact. The statistical improbability of that record, given what Easy Company went through, is not small. These were not men sitting in rear area billets. They were in direct contact with the enemy at every major engagement of the Western Front's final year.
The men who knew him had their own explanations. He moved carefully. He never took unnecessary risks. He understood terrain instinctively and used it correctly. He didn't expose himself without reason. These are the habits of a hunter, someone who had spent a lifetime in environments where a careless step or a moment of impatience had real consequences. In combat, those habits translated directly into survival. He also had, in the assessment of virtually every man who served alongside him, an unusually accurate sense of where danger was coming from. Not supernatural, practical. The same pattern recognition that found a hidden 88mm gun and a sniper in a window worked continuously in every engagement as a kind of early warning system that most soldiers never fully develop. When the war ended, Shifty Powers went home to Clinchco, Virginia. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't seek speaking engagements or veterans organization leadership positions. He went back to the mountains, back to the work, back to the life he had left in 1942. He was 22 years old when it was over. He had seen things that most men his age had only read about in newspapers, and he carried those things the way men of his generation typically carried them, quietly, internally, without making them the center of his public identity. He married, he raised a family, he hunted, he kept shooting, because shooting was never about the war for Shifty Powers. It was about the mountains, and the mountains were still there. In his later years, friends and family gave him a restored M1 Garand, the same model he had carried through 3 combat jumps and the frozen forests of Belgium. At 80 years old, he took it to a range and put rounds into a 6-inch circle at 300 yards. Iron sights, same as always. He died on June 17, 2009. He was 86 years old. The bullet holes from the assault on Foy are still visible today on a stone farm building in the village. The church still stands. The fields between the tree line and the village edge are still open ground, quiet now and green in summer, with no particular sign of what happened there on a frozen January morning 60 years ago, except for the marks in the stone that the rifles left behind. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who'd appreciate it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There is one final piece of this story worth examining, because millions of people encountered Shifty Powers not through a history book or a veteran's testimony, but through a television screen. Band of Brothers brought Easy Company to a global audience, and the question of what that series got right, what it compressed, and what it quietly left out tells you something important about the distance between history and the stories we choose to tell about it. Band of Brothers premiered on HBO on September 9, 2001, 60 years after the war it depicted. Produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, based on Stephen Ambrose's 1992 book of the same name, it reached an audience that numbered in the tens of millions across its original broadcast run and has kept finding new viewers in the decades since. For most people alive today, it is the primary lens through which they know Easy Company, the 506th PIR, and Daryl Powers. That is worth examining honestly, because what the screen showed and what happened in that field are related, but they are not identical. Episode 7, The Breaking Point, covers the Ardennes period culminating in the assault on Foy. It is widely considered one of the strongest episodes of the series, tightly written, emotionally devastating, and visually accurate in many of its details. The foxholes, the cold, the tree bursts, the deterioration of the men after weeks in impossible conditions, all of that lands with real force, and the historical foundation holds up. The sniper scene runs for roughly 30 seconds of screen time. In the series, the engagement is staged so that First Sergeant Carwood Lipton deliberately exposes himself as bait, drawing the sniper's attention and giving Shifty a stationary target to engage. It is a dramatically clean solution. One man accepts risk so another can act. It echoes, as some viewers have noted, a similar beat in Saving Private Ryan. Captain Miller drawing fire to expose a sniper for Private Jackson. The parallel is almost certainly intentional. The historical record does not support the bait scenario. According to multiple accounts, including the recollections documented by Lipton himself and corroborated by Sergeant Rodney Wynne, Shifty identified the sniper independently, without assistance, while the assault was still actively underway. He spotted the position on his own, shouted that he had a target, and fired. There was no coordinated bait maneuver. There was one man who saw something no one else could see, and one man who acted on it.
The series also depicts the engagement as taking place after Foy had been largely cleared, a quieter moment, the battle winding down, one final threat neutralized. The reality was messier and more urgent. The sniper was operating during the assault itself, actively pinning down the advance, and Shifty's shot came while the attack was still in the balance. The stakes in the historical version are considerably higher than the screen suggests. There is a note worth making about Scott Grimes, the actor who played Donald Malarkey in the series, not Shifty, and about the broader production approach. The cast members were put through a version of paratrooper training under military advisor Captain Dale Dye, and many of them attempted to contact the veterans they were portraying. Some of those conversations happened, some didn't. Shifty Powers himself was notably reluctant to engage with the production. When the series was in development, attempts to reach him were unsuccessful. A network executive could not contact him. Even Richard Winters, who wrote to Shifty personally, received a reply not from Shifty, but from his daughter Margot, who indicated that after the experience with Ambrose's book, her father had reservations about how his story might be used. That detail matters. Shifty Powers had already expressed, through a letter to Stephen Ambrose years earlier, that he felt the book had not been a fully accurate account of Easy Company's war. He was not a man who sought to correct the record publicly. He was too private for that. But he was also not a man who considered the popular version of his story the final word. What the series did capture, in spite of its dramatic compressions, was something real about Shifty's character. The portrayal is quiet, undemonstrative, and almost startlingly calm. He doesn't perform heroism, he just shoots. And the line that follows, delivered by the actor playing Popeye Wynne, drawn from something Wynne actually said, landed with enough truth that it has followed Shifty Powers through history ever since. It just doesn't pay to be shooting at Shifty when he's got a rifle.
That line came from the real Wynne. It described the real man. And of all the things the series preserved from the historical record, that may be the most accurate sentence in the episode. Band of Brothers gave Shifty Powers a global audience. Millions of people who had never heard of Clinchco Virginia or the Bois Jacques or the 321st Glider Field Artillery Battalion came away from that series knowing his name and his face and a version of what he did. That is not nothing. The series honored him in the way that popular storytelling honors people, imperfectly, with compression and dramatic license, but with genuine respect for the man at its center. The fuller history honors him differently. It gives back the context the screen couldn't fit, the 20 years of mountain hunting that built his eye, the machinist's spatial precision, the December morning when a tree that wasn't there the day before saved 150 men from an 88mm gun nobody else had found. The frozen field on January 13th, where the assault stalled, and one man, without assistance, without optics, without any hesitation visible to the men around him, looked at a building 400 feet away and simply saw. Popeye Wynne was right. It didn't pay to be shooting at Shifty when he had a rifle. It especially didn't pay to be hiding from him. If Shifty Powers' story moved you, the least we can do is hit like and subscribe. These men gave everything. The only thing we're asking from you is a click. Don't let their stories disappear. See you next week.